Hi, I have a mic and a pulse, and today I'm going to talk about Fallout 4. I really like Fallout 4. I have spent many an hour exploring the Commonwealth, rebuilding civilization one shack at a time, and fighting the forces of injustice / wanting to eat me. However, despite being great fun to play, it's held back by some problems with its writing. It has everything it needs for a solid conflict, but it doesn't put it together quite right. So, on the grounds that it's better to take up a hobby than to curse the darkness, I'm going to attempt to rewrite this $100 million video game using a knowledge of story structure gained mostly from YouTube. Since the main weakness of the story is the Institute, this video will focus on them. So, without further ado, Part 1. I want them to believe. The single biggest problem with the Institute's writing is their lack of a clear driving goal or belief, and you really need those in a story. Without a goal stronger than wait underground for everyone else to die, you're left with a faction that's not diabolically evil and not tragically noble, but instead just feels kind of pointless. They just do bad things and say it's science for no particular reason. It also makes it both unsatisfying to fight them, because there's no master plan you have to thwart to save everyone, and it's unsatisfying to help them too, because you don't even know what goal you're helping them reach. It also messes up any possible redemption arc, since you can't show them a better path to the same goal if there is no goal. That being said, there is a goal that's incredibly close to the surface that the game doesn't fully seize upon. They turned Kellogg into a cyborg, created super mutants, and then started building Gen 3 synths to be like humans but stronger and hardier, all of which clearly points towards a goal of making something better than humanity, driven by the belief that humanity isn't strong enough or good enough for the post-apocalyptic world. It's actually possible that they did have this goal at some point in development, since their catchphrase is Humanity Redefined, which clearly references this idea, and if so, I have no idea why they cut it. Now, inspired by the fact that they're science villains, I would say a good belief is a lot like a good scientific theory. A theory is based on evidence, explains the facts, and can be disproven through testing, while a good belief is also based on evidence, explains a character's actions, and can be disproven through the events of the story. The evidence that humanity isn't good enough is that mutants nuked the world out of greed and hate and stupidity, and 200 years later have barely rebuilt anything and continue to fight each other instead of uniting. Even in places like the West Coast, where there is more rebuilding, humans are clearly falling back into their own patterns of greed and stupidity. The action it explains is their desire to create first stronger humans and then a new type of person entirely from scratch, and the way it could be disproven is by showing them that humanity is better than they give it credit for and they shouldn't give up. The synths are the real fake meat of the story, but first we need to talk about Kellogg and the super mutants. So, without further ado again, Part 1. Kellogg versus the Frosted Flake. So Kellogg works as a character. He makes a good semi-psychopathic, just business type mercenary, and part of me actually wishes he could have stuck around for longer, but I don't know how to make that work without just having a pane of bulletproof glass between you every time you meet. Having you go through his memories after he died was also a neat bit of storytelling. The part where he's a cyborg is a bit weird though. He has to be immortal for the Sean's age twist to work, and it's a good and plot-critical twist, so we'll keep it, but for some reason the only cyborg is Kellogg, which is odd because if I remember my Greek mythology, immortality is often considered a good thing, and making cyborgs would be part of their goal of improving humanity. So we're going to fudge the numbers here and say that they stopped doing it because that degree of cyborgization is very painful and not worth living with long term unless you're Kellogg, because it's not like he was going to be happy anyway. And they'd already started shifting focus to synths, so they moved on from the technology. Part 2. Mutants! What are they there for? Absolutely nothing! Now we get to the super mutants. Giving the Institute the goal of improving humanity makes it more clear why they were making mutants, but it doesn't in any way explain why there are so many on the surface. As is, they kidnapped hundreds of people over at least 100 years while making mutants dumber and more violent than the ones the Master made using some FEV he just kind of found in the desert, sitting in giant underground vats like the world's third most evil wonton soup. The Institute then released them into the wild so that they could eat people, instead of carefully studying them in the rooms they built specifically to carefully study them in, all while not getting much data and not really furthering the technology. Now, there's no real reason to make that many mutants and release them unless you're A, building an army, or B, trying to get everyone on the surface killed, and neither of those furthers the Institute's goals. My proposed change is that instead of spending 100 years kidnapping people, they tested the FEV on a few large raider camps at once using aerosol bombs. Their strain of FEV killed most cells in petri dishes, so they expected it to kill most of the raiders, and since killing raiders is a good thing, that's not that bad an action. Unfortunately, the FEV was actually much more effective and less lethal when used on an entire human subject because technobabble, resulting in far more of the raiders surviving than they had hoped for. Now, this is objectively a terrible idea. But, to quote an excellent webcomic, mad science means never stopping to ask, what's the worst thing that could happen? And it's better than the insanity of doing the same thing for 200 years and expecting different results. It gets us mutants in large numbers, it gets them above ground, and it frees us from that little twinge of guilt you get from killing a mutant who you know was once just a woman trying to make a way for herself in this cruel world, or a man who loved his family. You guys feel that, right? You know the horror these creatures have been the victim of? I'm just kidding, we're all sociopaths here. We do still need Virgil to break out, though, which means there do need to be some experiments. Since he was working on a cure, I'm going to say that the experiments were about finding a cure. He thought they were testing on old mutants, but it turns out the Institute was actually mutating kidnapping victims because the raider-based wild ones were too hard to capture alive and control once captured. When he learned this, he rebelled and escaped, and then you found him. Also, fun fact, in Dante's Inferno, Virgil was Dante's guide into hell, much like Virgil is your guide to the Institute. Part 3. Do androids dream of radioactive cattle? So in this rewrite, the Institute has not spent 200 years developing semi-skilled laborers that sometimes run away, but has instead been working on a superior replacement for humanity. As stated above, humanity is pretty terrible, so instead of just trying to make merely stronger humans, they're also trying to make them smarter, wiser, and more selfless, as well as less violent and more compassionate. They also want them to have free will, not just be puppets acting out a show of humanity. This creates an inherent tension, because they can't truly be free if the Institute has programmed their minds. But the Institute can't know that they're good without programming them. This is further complicated by the fact that they have an organic brain, which can rebuild itself in a way that conflicts with their built-in programming, which can sometimes cause them to glitch and behave erratically. The Institute, knowing the danger of uncontrolled experiments from the super mutants, and the danger of synths glitching from the broken mask incident, is always watching closely to make sure none of them glitch, which causes many synths to fear that if they ever make a wrong move or have a mild episode, then they'll have their minds reprogrammed or be taken apart, which leads them to flee the Institute, which leads the Institute to have to make coursers to hunt them down. And coursers are a betrayal of the Institute's plan for synths because they have significantly less free will and have had their entire personalities programmed to a rigid, greater good of all synth-kind mindset. This would also make the conflict with the Railroad a little deeper than just synths or slaves, since the Railroad believes that as sentient beings, synths have a right to their freedom. But the Institute thinks that they're reckless radicals who are putting people in peril by putting synths who could malfunction at any time into the population, which would also endanger the Institute because there's still a possibility that determined enough civilians could find some weakness if provoked thoroughly. The Institute's goal to have synths replace mankind also strengthens their conflict with the Brotherhood, since machine design to replace humanity is far worse than a machine that merely has free will, especially since some normal robots have shown a surprising degree of independence. It also justifies their fear that the synths could rise up and overtake humanity, since that could happen if the Institute gets impatient waiting for us to kill ourselves again. I should also mention that the Institute is running out of time to finish them, since they were never very large, and even assuming they're somewhat bigger than we see on screen and recruit the occasional outsider, they're pretty close to full Habsburg. So I'm going to say that because everyone is everyone else's cousin, they don't have any kids in this rewrite, with the youngest generation already in its 30s. I'm also going to tie in the reactor-centric main quest to the synth-centric actual story by saying that they need the reactor to power the synth machine in robotics, without which it's a much slower process, preventing both mass production and easy iteration. I'm also going to tie in the reactor quest to the fight against the Brotherhood by giving them a weather machine that would have massive power requirements but would be able to generate lightning storms, a la Skyrim's Stormcall, that could be used against the Pridwen, since that would create a nice payoff to the reactor questline, and you want things to have a setup and a payoff. Hijacking Prime has no setup, and therefore is not a satisfying payoff to anything, it's just a thing that happens. So, for a long-term plan for synths, once they've perfected the design flaws, assuming such a thing is even possible, the three main options are A, kill everyone, B, sit in a bunker and wait for everyone to die, or C, actually use your power to help people. A is least likely because the synths are designed to be fairly moral, but you could do it as a true bad ending, like poisoning Project Purity in 3. Maybe you use the weather machine to make a giant rad storm that irradiates everyone and have to kill them again as ghouls. B is the Institute's actual plan. They finish work on the synths, and then the synths build their own society underground, free from the dangers of the surface world. C is the redemption option that was missing in the main game, and would be a hard sell for a number of reasons. First, it would place the synths in extreme danger on account of all of the mutants, raiders, and monsters that the extremely observant among you may have caught glimpses of during your playthroughs. Father, in particular, would be opposed to any plan that risks the synths, since they're his life work, and he thinks of them as the family he never had, possibly because he was a social outcast in the Institute due to always being the experiment kid rather than a normal member. Secondly, it would likely result in synths being treated as servants to humanity, being made to do manual labor and dangerous work that humans didn't want to, kind of like when Nick Valentine was Diamond City's handyman. If this dangerous work also included being made to fight, it would risk the moral corruption that the Institute had hoped to avoid for the synths. And third, there's no reason why anyone on the surface would take the Institute's help, given their track record. Any synths who were identified as such would likely be killed on sight, so there really isn't any point in sending them up there to begin with. You could maybe have them infiltrate society, but a large influx of strangely polite, well-educated, and friendly newcomers would likely lead to suspicion that would likely result in their deaths, and the deaths of others caught up in the paranoia. So, if you want to get the Institute's help, first you have to deal with these issues. And the most effective way to deal with all of these is with the Minutemen and settlements. Some of you may be groaning here. The Minutemen have too few characters, too many Radiant quests, and a quest line that just sort of vanishes halfway through Act 2. But nonetheless, they present the most viable option from a story perspective. By rebuilding them, you can show that humanity isn't dying yet, and that there are still good people willing to fight for good causes. And by building safe and healthy settlements, you can make places where synths will be relatively safe, as well as using your influence in them to make sure they get decent jobs, which should be especially possible because they could be programmed with useful skills like engineering and medicine. I don't know what the actual threshold to meet would be, since some people really don't like settlements, and even most people who do are only in the mood some of the time, so that if the game rewarded you for having already built settlements on your own initiative, you'd feel good, but if they made you go out and do a bunch of settlement stuff you hadn't felt like in order to get a better ending, then that would be deeply annoying. Still, you have to have some settlements at least as a proof of concept, so I'm going to arbitrarily say somewhere between 10 to 15 settlements and 50 to 100 population. Feel free to do whatever you want to that number in your head. In addition to the basic building of infrastructure, you'll need to do something flashy to grab the Institute's attention and make them realize that the Minutemen are back in force. And the best time to do that would be at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill is a solid story moment in the base game, making you realize that the conflict is bigger than just you and you can't stop it. I'm going to ruin that by having Bunker Hill be something you can stop by calling for Minutemen help, or possibly having them call for Minutemen help on their own initiative, at which point you could use the Minutemen soldiers there to demand that everyone stand down because this is a civilian area and they are not risking civilian casualties. And since the Minutemen have both the moral and physical high ground here, everyone would grumblingly agree to it. Then you'd go and have the roof talk with Father and argue about what happened. Points about the relative merits of humanity and synths would be reiterated, and you make one of those Star Trek speeches about how synths need to risk danger and be free and make their own choices if they're going to develop as a species, and he accepts your point. Then you do the normal Institute questline through getting the reactor and killing the Brotherhood, since they don't believe that the Institute can be trusted to do the right thing, especially since they could just kill you and replace you with a synth if they disagree with your policies. The Railroad would have a peaceful option since you're agreeing to let the synths be free and stop doing evil, and that's what they want. With the reactor, they now have the synthesizer running, so they have the power to help. But you still need a way to make the Commonwealth trust them, so I'm going to propose a fake Minutemen takeover. You're both the director and the general, so you arrange with the other Institute leaders to stage a battle in which the Minutemen take over the Institute and make those blackguards use their science for good, with you bringing along Preston, Ronnie Shaw, Sturgis, a companion or two, and also Piper to get the word out. So you go, you fight the prearranged Gen 1s with bad aim for a little while, and then the lights go out. See, we talked about what you want and what the Institute wants, but we didn't talk much about what the synths want. Most of the normal Gen 3s would be excited to see the surface and, being designed to be compassionate, would probably want to help the humans living there. But the Coursers are programmed to believe in the greater good, and were told that all of the time they spent hunting down their own terrified brethren was for the purpose of making a future for synths. One where they were masters of the whole world. Then you came along and decided that instead synths were just going to be workers for humanity, a race they had been led to believe was inferior to them, and instead of taking that lying down, they decided to fight back, and you just gave them the synthesizer. So now you've got to fight a whole lot of coursers, which will involve getting to biotech, where the scientists are being held prisoner, overloading biotech's miniature indoor weather machine to clear out the coursers in the atrium, and then going to advanced systems to shut down the reactor so that they can't keep making reinforcements, and then breaking into robotics to defeat the last of them, where you find that their leader, X6, has already killed the lead roboticists and destroyed the synthesizer, and he tells you that the synths will never be humanity's slaves, and then you fight to the death. Assuming you win, at that point you've pretty much beaten the game. Father formally surrenders the Institute to you, and you talk about how he's crushed, but has some hope that you will use the Institute for good and treat the remaining synths with care, and he dies peacefully. Cue Ron Perlman. Then maybe you cut to a few days later and the Institute is start to rebuild, and even though the synthesizer has been destroyed and probably won't be rebuilt for a while because the roboticists are all dead, the part of the Institute that wasn't destroyed is filled with people working very hard on new projects like making better Minutemen weapons, improving the teleporter's range, possibly developing synthetic horses for the Minutemen, since the synth animals were always made by bioscience and not robotics, and above all, trying to share all of their knowledge of technology with the people of the Commonwealth so that they'll be able to use it after the Institute scientists are gone. So yeah, happy-ish ending. Brotherhood killed, half of Institute destroyed, no more sense being made, but still, an atmosphere of hope, and you didn't have to betray your son. So, this video has gone on long enough, but I have a few more thoughts, so out of respect for your time, I will voice them in a 60-second lightning round! 1. Add some intelligence checks. If I have 11 intelligence and build nuclear reactors for fun, I should be able to put these punks in their place, not just tell them I'm a nice guy. 2. Give synths Sean the ability to grow and age, on the theory that synths having a childhood might help them be more well-adjusted as adults, and that taking care of kids could teach them empathy. 3. Make Dogmeat a synth dog, also designed to help human synths learn empathy, since there's no way he's an actual purebred German Shepherd 200 years after the apocalypse. 4. Switch the Institute lasers for pulse guns, as well they're too early game to be straight upgrades, they can't be a downgrade of a 200-year-old weapon, and having them focus on robots and power armor would give them a niche of their own. 5. Have Sean give you Kellogg's old room, both for the symbolism and because it could have actual crafting equipment. 6. Add an emergency teleporter that kicks you out if you start murdering people so you can't just wipe out the entire Institute before the end of the main quest. 7. Add an actual conversation with Nick where you talk to him about Sean instead of dropping the subject entirely after he helped you find him. And 8. Drop the military background, as it constrains role-playing without adding anything to your character. Also, have Ron Perlman voice Soul! Thank you for watching. In my next video, I'm going to be talking about the Brotherhood, since I've kind of ended up making them the bad guys, and I think there are a couple tricks that could make them a lot more sympathetic. So, subscribe if you want to see that. It should come out eventually.